As often as I've wished for Ohio to disappear, this is not what I had in mind. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. The band Hawthorne Heights has a song called Ohio is for Lovers. And while that just might be the boldest lie I've ever heard about Pennsylvania's most disappointing neighbor, it's not the worst of them. No, that award goes to David Paulides, whose section on Ohio in Missing 411 Eastern United States may be the worst set of misrepresented facts about things that happened in the Buckeye State that I have ever seen. Well, that and the weird thing that happened with Brazilians a few weeks ago on Twitter. In case you missed it, apparently Brazilians think they invented the airplane, even though the rest of the world is well aware that it was Dayton, Ohio's own Wright brothers. Yeah, that's right. I'm defending Ohio. Brazil messed up so bad that they have me defending Ohio. All of that aside, our ongoing series on fact-checking the Missing 411 books must go on, and that means it must take us into the land of 1,000 stolen Pennsylvanian ideas. Now, you might think that Ohio is so boring that we couldn't possibly make an entire video about it. But shockingly, the truth is that I was actually able to write two. One of them was even covering just one case from the region. To be fair, we've also touched on this state's strange missing persons cases before. In particular, the disappearance of Brian Schaefer remains one of the more intriguing stories we've ever looked into. And while Paulides eventually did manage to find a way to wrangle a case about a college student disappearing from a bar in an urban area into his series about people who vanished in national parks, he didn't do that until Missing 411: A Sobering Coincidence, aka How to Rip Off the Smiley Face Killers guys in 379 pages. Since that case is so very different from all the others in Missing 411 Eastern United States, and because we've already covered it in so much detail elsewhere, I've chosen to focus on the several older cases presented in that book. Before we get to that, though, I also want to talk about an even older mystery from the region, because the first people to disappear from Ohio were not farmers, berry pickers, toddlers, or teenage laborers. They were a native people whose origin, identity, and ultimate fate are all shrouded in mystery. Speaking of making things disappear, though, we'd like to take a minute to talk to you about this week's sponsor, Fume. We've been working with Fume for a few years now, and that's because we support the mission of the product they offer. That being to help people quit their bad habits by simply taking the bad part out of the habit. And as we start off the new year, there's no better time to make a resolution to be healthier. The way it works is simple. When you feel like you need to reach for something with a filter or a filament, you just reach for your Fume instead. It's a simple mechanical device made out of wood and stainless steel, which uses nothing but a flavored fiber core to deliver a similar sensation to what you're used to, just without any of the toxic materials. You just open this little valve at the bottom to control the intensity, pull air through the device into your mouth, like so, and then blow out, simulating the familiar experience of your normal bad habit without bringing any unwanted junk into your lungs. So, if you're ready to get started on the journey to leaving your bad habits behind, then you can start off 2026 by heading to tryfume.com and ordering the Journey Pack. And if you order using code LORELODGE, you'll also get a free silicone topper for your device. Not only that, but for the month of January only, Fume will double any core order for free. So, if you're a returning user, now is the time to stock up on your preferred flavors at a massive discount. Again, that is tryfume.com or tryfum.com and use code LORELODGE at checkout. Long before the wasteland we know as the state of Ohio existed, the southern half of that region was home to an enigmatic indigenous society known to us as the Hopewell culture. Preceded by an equally ambiguous civilization known to us as the Adena culture, the Hopewell were one of the mysterious mound builder societies who left their mark on the North American landscape in the form of the large earthworks found scattered across the Midwest and as far-flung as the western shores of the Mississippi. Now, very little is known of the Adena, who flourished from around the 6th century BC to the 1st century of the new millennium, besides the fact that they were a Stone Age culture which ultimately occupied long-term settlements in the Ohio River Valley, sustaining themselves through hunting, foraging, and small-scale cultivation of crops like pumpkin, squash, and sunflowers. There's even some evidence that they had begun to work with beet and copper, but they never made it to the stage of smelting before the transition into the Hopewell period. That transition may have been the result of a growing population attained through further innovation and reliance upon agriculture, which eventually eliminated the need to move with the herds of deer and elk throughout the course of the year. At some point in the development of the Adena, they began to construct large mounds at the center of their settlements, which, had the Europeans arrived a millennium and a half earlier, might have reminded them of the Celtic hill forts commonly found throughout France and the British Isles. To the Adena and their Hopewell successors, however, these earthworks served a very different function. While they might have been used for defensive purposes in times of emergency, their primary use was for burying the dead. Some archaeologists believe that these mounds actually originated as something more akin to mausoleums, which were built above ground and used until they became full, at which point the structure would be burned, the remains covered over with dirt, and then replaced with another built atop the ashes of the first. Over time, as this process was repeated, these burial sites grew into the large mounds for which the Adena and the Hopewell are now famous. Others suggest that they originated as single burial sites in designated cemetery plots, which, as the population grew and the bodies literally piled up, were built up into artificial hills. Either way, for some reason, the people of the late Adena period began to build circular ridges around their mounds, the function of which remains an enigma for modern archaeologists. That's not to say that there aren't any hypotheses, but as of right now, we aren't really sure what they're for. And that, my friends, is how you handle historical archaeological quandaries. By saying, you know what, we have ideas, but we haven't come up with any solutions yet. You don't insist that archaeology is hiding everything from people and saying that it's all a lie and there was some ancient world-spanning culture and that, you found the lost city of Atlantis, even though all you actually did was point to a collapsed volcanic dome and then said, "Hi, I'm Jimmy Corsetti, I know what I'm talking about." Anyway, precisely how the transition between the Adena and Hopewell periods occurred is still a matter of debate, but it doesn't appear to have been sudden or violent. It may be that the Adena simply grew into the Hopewell, though certain differences in the material culture of the later group imply that there was some kind of migration during the process. Where that migration came from, though, is anybody's guess. It may even be that there never truly was an Adena culture, but rather that the mortuary practices, which culminated in the development of the mound sites, were widespread throughout the region simply because it was easier to pile dirt onto somebody's body than it was to dig a grave or build a funeral pyre. At the same time, many of the mounds contain remains that appear to have been cremated, so it could be that there were religious beliefs associated with the practice that we simply don't know about. What we do know is that between about 100 AD and 300 AD, a tradition developed in the area which we've now come to describe as the Hopewell culture. And whoever they were, they went on to become a considerably more advanced, territorially larger, and commercially exceptional civilization. Where the people who built the Adena mounds were barely into the early stages of agriculture and political stratification, the Hopewell, at their height, had something which might be described as chiefdoms, the beginnings of organized religion, and far-reaching trade networks which span the distance from Lake Ontario to Florida and from the Susquehanna to the Mississippi. The Ohio River likely functioned as the main transportation route across Hopewell territory, allowing their traders to interact with both the ancestors of the Algonquian peoples of the northeast and the forebears of the Siouans to the west. For around 500 years, the Hopewell culture dominated the Midwest, and influenced tribes and traditions across much of the eastern half of what is now the United States. But then, around 500 AD, they seem to have all but vanished. Though mound building and much of the social stratification which had grown up out of the Ohio River Valley continued along the Mississippi River, eventually developing into the Mississippian culture, Ohio itself, as well as the surrounding regions, saw a marked decline in the scale of civilization. Mound building dwindled into obsolescence, trade networks ceased to operate, and the artistic style of the people who for so long had been the paramount society between the Great Lakes and the Appalachians faded into the mists of history. Not until the Fort Ancient culture arose at the beginning of the second millennium would there be anything on the scale of what the Hopewell had once been, and even then, their influence was a shadow of that which had come before. Now, there are a range of beliefs regarding what caused the decline of the Hopewell, from climate change caused by the volcanic winter of 536 AD to the possibility that greater populations and stratification ultimately led to catastrophic wars, which forced the people of the region to gather into smaller, more easily defensible settlements. In truth, it was most likely a combination of these and other factors. The increase in walled villages and the development of the bow and arrow seemed to support the latter, Though, if what happened in Europe during that time period is any indicator, climate change also played a role. One of the most intriguing questions, though, at least in my opinion, is not what happened to the Hopewell, but who were they? When Europeans first arrived on the shores of New England and Virginia, they encountered tribes which had no memory of the Hopewell. Sure, they were far to the east, but even the Iroquois and Cherokee of Tennessee and the Haudenosaunee of New York struggled to explain who had been there before them. To this day, archaeologists don't even seem to believe the origin story that the Iroquois tell themselves, arguing that they came south from Canada rather than east from the Mississippi. It doesn't help matters that both the Cherokee and their northeastern cousins date their migrations to a full millennium after the decline of the Hopewell, towards the end of the Mississippian culture in the mid-second millennium. The Algonquian peoples claim to have been in the Dawnlands since time immemorial, and the Anishinaabe branch of that ethno-linguistic group tells of a migration westward, not the other way around, sometime in the last 1,500 years. And interestingly enough, in that story, they don't mention coming across anyone. Another confounding issue in identifying who the Hopewell actually were and if they were wiped out entirely or evolved into some other group is that they sort of exist at the confluence of a bunch of different linguistic groups. The Algonquians are directly to their east, the Siouans directly to their west, the Creek to their south, and the Iroquois to their north. Given the confusing origin of the Iroquois, it would seem to make the most sense that the Hopewell might have been their ancestors, but the people of the Five and Six Nations confederacies said that they came from further west than that. Granted, they came from further west than that 1,000 years after the Hopewell declined, so who really knows? But it's just an interesting study in how archaeology often leaves gaps, and the only thing that could fix those gaps is history, but we don't have any of it written. The fact of the matter is that we may never really know who the Hopewell were or what happened to them. But what we do know is precisely what happened to almost every single person listed in the Ohio cluster of missing 411 eastern United States. The earliest of the Ohio disappearances described by David Paulides is that of Riley Amsbaugh, who vanished from his farm in Campbell's Mills on July 25, 1902. But this case actually doesn't come from the Ohio section of the book. Instead, it can be found in the Missing Farmers section, though the author notes that it also could have qualified for the Berry Pickers section. However, because Riley was primarily farming at the time, he opted for farmers. I don't know, guys, I don't make the rules. Like most of the Ohio entries, it's very short. According to Paulides, newspapers described Amsbaugh's disappearance as mysterious, though he doesn't really elaborate on why that is. To his credit, the reasoning given is that beyond Riley being expected back for lunch, having been seen in his cornfield and then a berry patch around 10 a.m., and the sheriff organizing a search, few other details were available. That's it. The story just ends with the statement, "No clues have been found." So let's start with the parts of the narrative which are actually true, because it makes the payoff that much more entertaining when we get to the pieces that aren't. Riley Amsbaugh was, as Paulides wrote, 55 years old. He was last seen at a blackberry patch around 10 a.m., and about 75 people were involved in the search. That's about it. Everything else is wrong, and it just gets even more wrong as the story progresses. Now, some of those issues are minor. For example, Riley disappeared on the 24th, not the 25th, and from Mansfield, not Campbell's Mills. So far as I can tell, there is no actual place called Campbell's Mills in Ohio. No village, no town, no community. But there does seem to have been a company or a farm referred to by that name in the area. It wasn't particularly hard to nail down the actual location of Riley's farm, considering the Mansfield News-Journal explained that it was on the Lucas Road, about 4.5 miles southeast of the city, and that the Pennsylvania Railroad runs through Mr. Amsbaugh's farm. I don't know what papers Paulides used, but using the one closest to the disappearance typically nets you the best results when it comes to this sort of thing. Now, what else is there? Well, Paulides wrote that Riley was a man of habit and was expected back at his house for lunch, but never returned. In reality, what the papers actually said was that he is a man of good habits, by which they meant he wasn't an alcoholic or otherwise an unreliable person, and that he was missed about dinner time. Again, technically very small issues, but it's important you understand the full scope of how utterly inaccurate Missing 411 can be as a series. It's also a more important detail than it would immediately appear to be, because it paints a picture of a man totally vanishing from the area within an hour or two of when he was last seen, which in turn makes the failure to find him more mysterious than it would otherwise be. The truth of the matter is that his family was at a funeral, and nobody actually noticed he was missing until 6 to 8 hours had elapsed. The scope of the search is also misrepresented to a not insignificant degree, not in number, but more so in organization. While Paulides claims that the sheriff was leading it, there's no evidence of that in the papers. What the paper does say is that a former sheriff said he'd seen a party of about 50 searchers out near Campbell's Mills, but not that the current sheriff was leading it, or even that the former sheriff was involved. Not only that, but when the paper went to print on the afternoon of Friday, July 25th, they hadn't even brought the bloodhounds out yet, and said that they might not do that at all, since so many people had already passed through the search area and disrupted any scent trails. Based on what we have from the News Journal, it would appear that the search was pretty amateur and disorganized, which isn't unusual for the period. So why was this considered mysterious at all? As it turns out, it's mainly because Riley Amsbaugh was very well off, had a known habit of carrying $40 to $70 worth of cash on him, and disappeared in an area not far from where the body of another man turned up a few years earlier. Paulides neglected to mention any of that, even though I could only really find coverage of this story from the one paper, so he must have had all of this information available to him. He also failed to mention that the paper explicitly said that another supposition is that Mr. Amsbaugh may have had a sunstroke and, having become demented, wandered off. That last bit is important, not only because it shows that there were two perfectly mundane theories for how the man had disappeared, but also because that's precisely what happened. As I've said before, what I used to think was just bad research seems more and more to be deliberate deception on the part of the author. That's because, along with the omission of existing theories, Paulides also failed to mention what was reported by the very same paper he must have used on the very next day. On July 26, 1902, the Mansfield News Journal included an article headlined, "Missing Man Returns Home After Wandering About Aimlessly." In that article, the author explained that Riley had been found by his own children at around 5 a.m. on the morning of the 26th, appearing very much bewildered and ill, and unable to give a very clear account of his wanderings. Physically, he was fine, if a little dehydrated, but Dr. R.S. Bowles told the paper that Amsbaugh was in a very nervous and distressed condition, indisposed to answer some questions, and apparently incapable of answering others. Now, you may be thinking, but Aiden, that's weird, right? I mean, how could he turn up alive on his own farm almost 2 days later when there had been such an extensive search? Those would be fair questions, but for the fact that the paper went on to explain that Riley told the doctor he had gone to Mount Vernon, walking most of the way there, and slept Thursday night in a barn. And as for how nobody thought to report seeing him, the simple answer is that it was 1902, and essentially nobody outside of Mansfield was even aware that he was missing. So all anybody who saw him on the side of the road would have perceived is an old guy walking on the side of the road. Once again, there could be fair questions, like how did he manage to walk all the way to Mount Vernon, over 20 miles away as the crow flies, and then back in just 43 hours? But Riley was actually able to account for that as well. For one, he said he passed through several towns, which would imply that he was traveling along the highway. We don't need to guess, though, because he also told Dr. Bowles that once a man in a buggy gave him a ride for about 4 miles. It's very possible that he got more than one ride, and it's only about 26 miles by the shortest route between the farm and Mount Vernon. If he started traveling around 10 a.m. on the 24th, it's entirely possible he could have made it there by early afternoon the next day. At most, we're talking about 13 or 14 hours of travel, and probably even fewer depending on how fast that buggy was moving. Having grown up not far from Amish country, let me tell you, those things can move. As for how he got home, the papers say that he took the train, and he arrived back in Mansfield at midnight. He then walked home and slept in the barn, after which his sons found him walking out towards the horse pasture with a halter in hand. Is that normal behavior? No. Is it mysterious that a 55-year-old man had a senior moment in 1902? Also no. Now, if we take the disappearance of Riley Amsbaugh away, because flat out it's not mysterious, then the next earliest Ohio disappearance is that of E.C. Jones. Or at least that's how it looks if you're reading the first page of the Ohio chapter. Unfortunately, someone made an oopsie, because E.C. Jones actually went missing from Iowa. That said, it's an objectively hilarious story, so let's give it a quick rundown. And since the entry is very short, I'll just read it to you. Kurt, the David Paulides mood lighting. Thank you. The Pocahontas County Sun newspaper describes another mysterious disappearance of a farmer on November 12, 1903. E.C. Jones was a man married only about a month when he kissed his new bride goodbye and headed into his cornfield to work. At 3 p.m., Jones had not returned from the field, so his wife requested one of the assistants to search the farm for Jones. The assistant found Jones' team wandering the field with one tug broken and one ear of corn in the wagon box. A search by the local community failed to find any sign of the young farmer. Strange, right? Wrong, but to be fair, not because any of that was incorrect. Although Paulides' assertion that Jones was of an unknown age is that he was 24. The real problem, though, is that what I just read to you is the entire entry, but not the entire story. It's true that Jones and his wife have been married about a month, that he disappeared after going to work in a cornfield, technically not his cornfield, but I won't nitpick, and that it was first noticed he was missing around 3 in the afternoon after his wagon and oxen were seen roaming around with nobody in sight. Paulides is also correct that the search began almost immediately and that the community did fail to find any sign of the young farmer, at least until the next day. See, David kept researching the story, he might have found an article in the Waterloo Courier which reported that the idea that the missing man had become temporarily deranged and wandered away was dispelled Wednesday afternoon when several letters were found in the cornfield near the wagon. According to the paper, they had been torn in little scraps and buried, but the searching party found 2 or 3 scraps which were not covered with dirt. The exact contents of the letters hadn't been reconstructed in time to make it to print, but the Courier did say that the envelopes were found with them and that Mrs. Jones confirmed they came from her husband's relatives. The paper also reported that the neighbors had decided that further search parties would be useless and came to the conclusion that E.C. Jones had left the country, something that Mrs. Jones also believed to be the case. Thing is, nobody seemed to know why. The Davenport Morning Star reported that Jones was prosperous, apparently happy, and content, and there is not even a suggestion of the reasons for his going. So, not at all the kind of mystery that's supposed to be appearing in a Missing 411 book, but to an extent a mystery nonetheless. That was until a little less than a month later, when Mrs. Jones reportedly received a letter from her missing husband. The Evening Times Republican printed that letter, postmarked from Minneapolis, in full, which reads as follows. Dear wife, well, Bud, I suppose you are satisfied now. You can get your own driver. Oh, Bud, I wish to God I would have been killed that Sunday night before I got to town. I know I am to blame more than you, but what you said about that driver and that night after we got home, I couldn't stand it. Bud, I know I have done foolish, but I never thought until after I had gone. I tried to get you over the telephone when I was at Hampton, but they wouldn't connect the bell on the Martin line. Bud, will you put my clothes in my telescope and keep them until I write for them? I go from here in the morning, I don't know where. And take good care of my wedding clothes, as I will never have no other. No other woman can be the same as you have been to me. I am going to be true to you as I was when I was there. Don't think I am going to be ornery and drink. You have learned me better. I am going to live up to you. Take that money, Bud, of ours, and use it to your best advantage. Only please don't use it in getting a new driver. Well, I will close, as I am quite sick and can't write any more. I won't say goodbye, Bud, as something tells me we shall meet again. If I thought you would forgive my mad act, it would be soon. Until then, Bud, farewell, my dear lost wife, Earl. P.S. Bud, you please write to Edna and tell her how I treated you. If you're confused, don't worry. So was everyone else. The Waterloo Courier reported that the letter is quite unintelligible to anyone outside of the Jones family, but did include a bit of explanation from Mrs. Jones, though the paper referred to her by her maiden name, which is obviously not a good sign for Mr. Jones. Apparently, the Joneses got into a bit of a kerfuffle on the Sunday before he disappeared, something to do with her wanting him to drive her over to a neighbor's house and bring home her sisters who had been out spending the evening. When Earl refused, his wife said something about finding someone else to drive the buggy for her, and based on the context, I'm guessing the argument was a bit more severe than the papers let on. I wouldn't be shocked if she said something which insulted his masculinity or implied that she could find a better husband, not just a better driver. Even if she did, though, leaving town completely, without saying anything, seems like a bit of an overreaction, and one that Earl came to recognize entirely too late. Though nothing showed up in the papers for a little while after that, the January 16, 1904 issue of the Davenport Morning Star did run an article entitled "Woman is Seeking a Divorce," and the woman in question was indeed Mrs. Jones / Miss Porter. The one odd thing about the article is that it says that the divorce was basically being filed on the grounds of abandonment and doesn't mention the letter from Earl, and just includes a line reading, "Nothing more has been heard from him." That could just be a journalistic error, though, and I was able to track down an article in the Evening Times Republican which mentioned the letter and gave a more detailed explanation of the situation, though not with any new information. Now, all of that said, this whole thing is still a little odd. One paper reported that the letters found torn up and buried were business-related, according to Mrs. Jones, and said that the police seemed to be of the same mind. So does that have anything to do with the phrase, "take that money"? And that's not the only weird part either. What did Earl mean by "put my clothes in my telescope"? Was he referring to a telescope case? That wouldn't really make much sense. But then again, neither does anything else I can think of unless it was some kind of code word, or if telescope just meant something entirely different to people living in 1903. There's another thing that strikes me as odd too, which is that Jones both said he planned to leave Minnesota tomorrow and that he didn't know where he was going, but also that he was too sick to continue writing, and on top of that he told his wife he would come home if she forgave him, even though he gave her no way of actually contacting him to do so. The whole thing is just so odd that it makes me wonder if this was some sort of goodbye Earl situation, which would of course be very fitting, aside from the lack of any claims that Earl Jones was abusing his wife physically. It's a weird story, no matter how you look at it, but the fact of the matter is that it's not the missing 411 kind of weird, nor did it take place in Ohio, so there's really no reason for David Paulides to include it within the book, let alone that cluster. The one thing it does have in common with any of the Ohio cases is that it centers on a farmer, as does the next one in our list. Though, oddly enough, it's the only one involving a farmer which actually ended up in the Ohio section of the book, even though all of them are listed in the missing farmer section. And this would be the case of William Pitzenbarger, who vanished from his farm in Hoagland Township in August of 1931. On August 7th, William walked across his cornfield wearing his overalls and a straw hat en route to do chores, Paulides writes. When William didn't return to his residence at the end of the day, a search ensued, one which continued to intensify as the days and weeks went on. That's about where his coverage of the search effort stops. Nothing about the theory that he hitchhiked out of town, nothing about how his health was reportedly failing rapidly just before his disappearance, not even a mention of the fact that he was barely able to walk, which of course would make the whole thing genuinely bizarre should he have genuinely disappeared. This time, however, Paulides actually does get the ending right. On August 31st, he writes, a searcher pulled the cover off a well near an abandoned cabin on the Fronefield farm, approximately 1/2 mile from the Pitzenbarger residence. Inside the well, searchers saw something odd 25 feet down. A recovery party pulled the deceased and decomposing body of William from the well. That is, for all intents and purposes, what happened, except for the bit about it being 25 feet down. The author goes on to say that William's body was generally intact, but with slight discoloration on the right eye, and that he was wearing the clothes he'd been wearing when he was last seen the day he disappeared, with the exception of the straw hat, which was never located. So why is this weird? According to David, it seems to have something to do with the explanation given for how William ended up in the well to begin with. As Paulides puts it, the coroner decided not to conduct an autopsy and ruled his death as a drowning, believing that the man looked into the well, hitting his head, after which the well cover miraculously fell back into place. A problem? That is not what the coroner actually concluded. In reality, the death was ruled to be self-inflicted, but there was no mention of him leaning over and hitting his head before falling in, nor any mention of the well cover being on when Pitzenbarger disappeared. As it turns out, the well was actually one of the first places examined, but the body was not discovered at the time. It also doesn't appear the well was actively in use, since the Sydney Daily News described the 48-inch wide, 24-foot deep well with 11 feet of water in it as back of an abandoned log house. To be fair to Paulides, one article published on September 1st, 1931, does say that when the body was first brought up, the coroner expressed the opinion that Pitzenbarger, because of ill health, probably had stumbled into the well while wandering, and that there was no evidence of foul play. That still leaves a very fair question. How does a man fall into a covered well? I didn't find anything about the coroner saying he'd probably been peering in and hit his head, but I also didn't find anything explicitly saying that the well would have been uncovered on the day Pitzenbarger disappeared. What I did find was an article from the Delphos Daily Herald, published August 10th, which mentioned that the search of the night was very thorough and included examination of open wells. Between that, the fact that the well was searched early on, and a report that Roby Kinney, the owner of the well, said he thought the object found in there might have been one of his sheep, it seems reasonable to assume that the well wasn't actually covered when William went missing, and that his body simply hadn't yet risen to the surface during the initial search effort. There's no explicit mention of dementia, but it can be extrapolated that senility might be covered under the description in ill health, given Pitzenbarger's more advanced age. The same cannot be said of the other Ohio disappearances, however, because every single one of them was under the age of 16. And one in particular is indeed peculiar. While most of the Ohio entries for eastern United States are rather short, a paragraph or two on average, the story of Carolyn Peterson takes up a full page at the beginning of the chapter. According to Politis, the 20-month-old little girl vanished on August 20th, 1947, after being put out into the yard to play while her mother did some chores inside. The family and neighbors launched a search almost immediately after Mrs. Peterson noticed that her daughter was missing, around 11 a.m., but it was to no avail, and police soon began to wonder if it was possible that Carolyn had been kidnapped. If you've read the Missing 411 books or watched our stuff in the past, you'll note that this is a very common starting point for these stories. For example, Rita Lent, to whom we devoted an entire episode to last week, starts off essentially the exact same way. In this case, though, it seems that Politis might have remembered that his stories are supposed to have something to do with the government lying to people about what's in the national parks. I mean, technically this happened closer to a state wilderness area, but close enough, right? And by close enough, I should be clear that Carolyn did not go missing in the state wilderness area. Her home was over 3 miles northwest of it, just outside of Waldo. So it's really still a tangential issue since, as Politis himself explains, she never got anywhere near the wilderness area. Maybe that's why he says she disappeared from 10 miles south of Marion, Ohio, and not a mile outside of Waldo, right alongside State Route 98. To cut an unnecessarily long story short, the Missing 411 version describes how soon after Carolyn disappeared, the area was inundated with 2 severe thunderstorms that dropped several inches of rain. This, he says, impeded the search effort temporarily, but the searchers were still able to drag the nearby Kukwa Creek, search the surrounding fields, and probe old wells. But despite all of that effort, and even with over 1,000 people involved in the search, they turned up nothing. Combined with the fact that the Peterson home was along a highway, the lack of any trace of the missing child led police to look at abduction as the most likely possibility, and quickly turned their attention towards tracking down potential suspects. Fortunately, they hadn't been at it very long when the case happened to resolve itself. On Saturday, August 23, 1947, a local farmer, Samuel Allmendigger, who Politis notes was 75 years old for some reason that isn't addressed again, was walking a perimeter path of his farm and heard a faint voice in a briar patch. Politis goes on to explain that the farmer couldn't believe someone would be in the patch, but he struggled his way through the thickets and found Carolyn Peterson alive. The farmer brought her out of the berry bushes and back to her house, and from there she was taken to the hospital for a checkup. Miraculously, she was perfectly fine despite spending 3 nights outside, with only some scratches and blackberry juice to mark her ordeal. There was one thing that stuck out, though, and that was the lack of any sunburn. Beyond the fact that she wasn't all that far away from where she'd been when she disappeared, she'd somehow avoided getting sunburned after 4 days in the August heat. And that was something the doctors were completely unable to explain. At least that's how David Politis tells the story. In all fairness, he's not particularly far off, for the most part. Carolyn did disappear on August 20th, she did live in a rural area off Route 98, and the trail had gone absolutely cold by the end of the second day of searches. In fact, according to the Marion Star, she'd barely been gone 24 hours when Sheriff Retterer turned to the theory that the child had been stolen. The problem was that nobody could think of any reason why. The parents had no enemies, at least none that sprung to mind, and there was no real evidence of any other motive. The one thing the sheriff came up with was that she was exceptionally pretty, and thus might have been the victim of a crime of opportunity conducted by childless adults who wanted a daughter of their own. That did seem to match with what witnesses had seen, including Carolyn's older brother, who is completely absent from Paulides' narrative. Carl, who was 3 years old, told his parents and the police that he'd seen a man get out of a yellow car near the house and that the car had been heading north. The parents and officers, however, reported the Marion Star, could not be positive that the car had any connection with the disappearance and doubted whether Carl would recognize the color yellow. I mainly included that bit because it's just such a weird thing to assume about a 3-year-old, considering colors are typically one of the first things kids learn to identify. And it seems it was Carl who said it was a yellow car in the first place. It doesn't matter, of course, because Carolyn was ultimately found alive, but there is an issue with that bit too. First of all, it needs to be mentioned that Carolyn actually was seen after disappearing from the farm. According to the Marion Star, Mr. and Mrs. Cockerell, neighbors, in the rural sense of the term, of the Petersons, were driving north along the highway at around 10:45 a.m. on the day Carolyn disappeared and saw her toddling along as rapidly as she could go, swinging her arms as she ran. Expressing regret that they hadn't stopped to check on the girl, they said she was almost to the Donathan Road, about 500 feet from the house. That's how I was able to get a general sense of both where Carolyn lived and where she was found. You see, Paulides doesn't give any particular location for that last bit, even though the papers reported that Carolyn was found 1,000 feet west of the farm home of her parents. It should also be noted that Paulides said that Carolyn was found on the property of Samuel Allmendigger, and only by accident. In reality, as the Springfield News-Sun reported, Allmendigger was acting on a hunch when he went out to search the spot where he came across Carolyn. The Marion Star also provided a very long article on the story, in which they reported that Carolyn was on the property of H.H. Rengert. Now, if you're suspecting that maybe Allmendigger was the culprit all along, I also wondered about that, especially in light of the fact that there was a $2,500 reward offered for information leading to Carolyn's whereabouts. If she'd been abducted, it could very well have been in hopes that there would have been a reward, and maybe Allmendigger was just waiting a few days so he could claim both the money and the praise. That would also explain the lack of sunburn and how Carolyn seemed perfectly fine, but for the fact that Allmendigger refused to accept the reward since the girl hadn't been kidnapped. Would it be possible that he abducted her for another purpose and then planted her back near her home when the search was intensified? Sure, but the Star provided a much simpler explanation for what happened during their August 25th issue. County officials, they reported, had attempted to reconstruct the route Carolyn took and were of the opinion that she might have followed the highway south until she reached Donathan Road, then turned west to follow it until she came to a long, narrow field running along the east side of the Quequad Ditch. From there, she would have passed through an open gate into a field, which she then traversed heading northwards until she came to a fence, and then she probably followed that until she found the berry patch. As for how she'd survived, physicians credited the mild temperature and generally good weather, along with the ample supply of blackberries, which brings us to the issue of her sunburn. Remember how Paulides said they couldn't explain why she wasn't sunburned? That's just not true. The Star explicitly said that investigators see no mystery about the lack of sunburn in view of the opportunities for protection afforded by the heavy undergrowth. The one thing that does throw a wrench into that whole explanation is the storms which reportedly passed through the area during the 4 days Carolyn was missing. Though the authorities wrote Carolyn's survival off as dumb luck, I do have to wonder if that may not have been the case. No matter how dense the brush around her was, severe rainstorms don't just soak you from above. Water comes down, gets blown horizontally, and of course, saturates the ground. Someone stuck outside for 2 days of storms is going to get wet no matter what, and even if the coldest it gets at night is 60 degrees, there's still a danger of hypothermia there. And Carolyn was in remarkably good shape for a toddler who'd just gone through something like that. Paulides doesn't bother to spend any time questioning the conclusion on this one, though, which just isn't even surprising at this point. Somehow it's weirder that she wasn't sunburned than that she didn't succumb to hypothermia. All of that said, I think the possibility that she was kidnapped by a neighbor who then got cold feet and returned her to a place and said that he had found her, or maybe just, put her somewhere and then somebody else found her, I think that's probably more likely than the possibility that something supernatural or otherwise connected to any of the other disappearances happened here. To give David Paulides the smallest amount of credit, I can understand why someone might, at first glance, perceive a pattern related to Carolyn. It's because almost exactly a year later, on August 5th, 1948, a little boy by the name of Jerry Lee Huffman disappeared under fairly similar circumstances from his family's home outside the village of Philo, Ohio. According to the politest version of the story, Jerry was outside playing with his family's pet collie, Laddie, when his father Dan last saw him. As is common with a lot of stories of missing kids, Dan went out to check on his son around dinner time, 6 p.m. in this case, and couldn't find him or the dog. I do have to wonder at what point the author just abandoned the whole national parks thing, because if you've noticed, not one of the disappearances in the entire Ohio cluster happened anywhere near a national park. The same is also true of the Pennsylvania and Minnesota clusters, and I think also might be of New York, but I haven't done an episode on that one yet. Obviously, it's coming. Anyway, we learned from Politis that the local sheriff and state police responded to the Huffman residence and started to formalize the search process, which would come to involve over 200 neighbors who immediately set out into the fields of corn, looking and yelling for Jerry Lee. They searched the dense forest surrounding Philo all night, but it wasn't until 12 hours after Mr. Huffman realized his son was missing that any sign of him turned up. At 6 o'clock a.m., the collie, Laddie, strolled up to the Huffman residence, apparently in a state of some emotional distress, and in a scene that sounds almost too Hollywood to be believable, Dan is said to have calmed the dog and then asked it to lead them to Jerry Lee, and of course that good boy did exactly as he'd just been asked. Mr. Huffman and a neighbor followed the dog for 1.5 miles across an adjacent cornfield to a fence, Politis writes, where the men found Jerry Lee with his foot caught in a fence and a wild grapevine around his neck. Jerry could have been in better shape, being described as naked, semi-conscious, and turning blue in the 55-degree weather. Thankfully, they were able to get him to nearby Bethesda Hospital, now Genesis Hospital after a merger with Good Samaritan back in 2015, where he was found to be in satisfactory condition by the medical staff. Now, if you're asking yourself, what on earth was unusual about this, or why would anyone put this in a book about people who went missing under mysterious circumstances, you're obviously just not seeing the bigger picture. You see, according to Politis, 3-year-old Jerry Lee never explained why he left, or what he did during his night in the fields, or why he removed his clothes. I mean, don't you get it? The toddler never managed to articulate why he wandered into the woods, what he'd done in the brief time he was missing, or why he was naked. I mean, anyone who's ever been around 3-year-old boys knows that their decisions are always completely rational, that they're very capable of vivid descriptions of their activities, and that they never take their clothes off without a good reason. Right? Look, if David Politis hadn't raised a son, I'd give him a pass on the total ignorance of how young boys behave, but he did raise a son. So there's no reason for him to have found this odd. The fact that Jerry Lee was 3 years old is explanation enough for everything, but we might as well itemize it while we're here. He wandered off because the dog chased a rabbit, or he just got curious about what was over that way. He didn't articulate where he'd been or what he'd been doing or why he'd been doing it, because 3-year-olds have extremely limited vocabularies and barely even understand their own actions. They also probably didn't bother to interrogate the child because he obviously hadn't been kidnapped and he was found only 1.5 miles away from the house. As for why he was naked, he might have taken his clothes off when it got dark because that's just what he did at bedtime every night, or he might have just decided he wanted to be naked. I mean, again, he was 3. But to be fair to David, he did accurately represent the story in basically every respect, which is honestly pretty unusual for Missing 411 in my experience. That said, this story is obviously only weird if someone is unfamiliar with the behavior of small children, especially boys, or if it's part of a broader pattern of children wandering off. The thing is, this happened over 70 miles from the disappearance of Carolyn Peterson, and while it does bear some resemblance to the disappearance and death of another toddler named Rita Lent back in the 1930s, Politis didn't make that connection. In fact, he put Rita into the Pennsylvania section, even though she went missing on the Ohio side of the border and not particularly close to any of the Pennsylvania disappearances. At the risk of beating a dead horse even further, there's one other disappearance involving a toddler which does almost perfectly match the story of Jerry Lee Huffman, but in this case it happened in January of 1960 and about 100 miles further to the northeast. 3.5-year-old Randy Moy was playing outside with his dogs when, as Politis puts it, for an inexplicable reason, the dogs went running straight into the woods, and Randy followed them in. Why might dogs run off into the woods? Gosh, I don't know. It's not like they ever chase after small animals or anything. I won't bore you with the details, mainly since Politis didn't bother to include any beyond the assets used in the search, but they found Randy 17 hours later in a briar patch next to a stream. Once again, literally nothing is weird about that whatsoever, but hey, we gotta sell books, right? With that, we come to the last case in the Ohio cluster, which is that of Johnny Lemke. Back in August of 1910, Johnny Lemke disappeared from a farm in Elyria, Ohio. According to Politis, the 15-year-old was last seen picking berries, and all that was found of him after an extensive search was the half-full pail he'd been using to collect them. It's a very short entry, even by Missing 411 standards, but Politis explains that the theories put forward by the authorities were that Johnny had either been killed while trying to run off another berry picker, or he had disturbed a hawk's nest. He doesn't go into any detail about either of those, but he does point out that the hawk's nest is an unusual explanation for this incident, as a 15-year-old boy is a large object for a hawk to try to carry away and consume. He's certainly correct about that, and adds that he's read many interesting conclusions to missing persons cases, especially in older articles, but many of the explanations have no basis in reality, but appear to be printed to offer some logical explanation to a very unusual event. Damn, he was so close to being honest for like half a page. See, the papers did print the suggestion that Johnny's disappearance had to do with a hawk's nest, but they absolutely did not suggest in any way, shape, or form that he'd been carried off and eaten by a bird. No, what the papers actually reported was that Johnny may have discovered a hawk's nest in some large tree, and in attempting to climb the trunk, met injury or became caught in the branches in some unlooked-for manner. Is that a very likely explanation, given that Lemke's name never shows up in the papers again after August of 1910? No, it really isn't. Is it remotely the same thing as suggesting he'd been attacked by a hawk? No. The much more likely explanation is that he did try to run off another berry picker, got into a fight, died during the scuffle, and then his body was hidden by whoever killed him. As far as Missing 411 clusters go, this one is so very close to the bottom of the barrel in terms of legitimacy. As I mentioned in our video on Missing 411 as a whole, there are 11 main profile points associated with Politis' work. These include proximity to granite, berry patches or swamps, the ability of dogs to track the person, dogs being present when people went missing, storms appearing soon after the disappearances, the incident occurring in a rural setting, people going missing in the afternoon, people being found in areas that had already been searched, people missing clothing when found, and my personal favorite, the missing individual being found in a conscious, semi-conscious, or unconscious state. Even if those weren't as contrived as they are, and for more on that, see our video, David Politis is Lying About Missing 411, they barely have any relevance to these stories. Granite is entirely absent from the whole cluster, berry patches only factor into some of them, swamps aren't involved in any of them, the rural setting is just a parameter in and of itself, the missing clothes aspect only appears in connection to one case, and that case is about a toddler, several of them happen in the morning and several others at night, dogs didn't fail to track any of them, and only a couple of people were found in places that had already been remotely searched. The last profile point, that being that the missing individual is found in a conscious, semi-conscious, or unconscious state, is just the individual was found when you break it down, and the books also include cases of people who weren't found at all, so it's just not really a profile point at all. So basically, the only thing that connects any of these cases is that a couple of the kids were with dogs when they went missing. That's it. Put simply, there are no mysterious cases in the Ohio cluster. There's not a single one. The only unsolved one is Rita Lent, but Politis put that into the Pennsylvania cluster for some reason likely known only to God and himself. Now, with all of that said, there have to be some unsolved missing persons cases in Ohio, right? Like, there's got to be some interesting ones out there. An entire state can't possibly be that boring. If a state were to be that boring, it would be Ohio, but I can't imagine it's not. So, if there's any Ohio-based cases that you would like me to cover, please let me know what they are. I will take a look. If there is enough material to make a video, I will do so. Maybe I'll make one covering a smattering of strange cases in Ohio. Maybe I'll be able to solve something. Maybe I'll be able to go, gosh, that's so confusing, strange. Also, if you want to give me suggestions on other states to cover, I think we covered Pennsylvania, Ohio, Minnesota, Montana, the Great Smoky Mountains, Yosemite. So yeah, if there's other states and clusters, or just other cases, please let me know in the comments. I am desperately looking for more stories to cover. There's only so many of these. We've been putting a video out every Friday for 4.5 years now. it's starting to get hard to identify good topics. And I mean, while we're on the topic of mysteries, another mystery is the algorithm and how that works. So if you want to help us to isolate ourselves from the whims of the almighty machine, you can do so by subscribing to us on Patreon for just $1 a month. There you will get ad-free versions of these videos, no sponsored segment, no YouTube ads, nothing, just pure Lore Lodge, pure missing persons and mysteries. You can also get our merch from Bunker Branding. It looks like this. There's 3 other designs, and it comes in hoodies as well. If you would prefer to drink the Lodge, you can absolutely do so by going to Tableau Roasting Company, it's linked in the description, and purchasing Mount Pocono Perk, which is our signature coffee blend that I designed myself. And by that I mean I told Matt Moore over at Tableau precisely what beans I wanted from precisely what places and even what temperatures I wanted them roasted at. This is not your average influencer coffee brand. Now, if you're simply looking to get more Lodge and you want it for free, you can have it. We have multiple other channels, the most active of which is History Unhinged. Videos go up on there every 2 weeks on Saturday, if we remember to make sure they go up on Saturday. And that is a collaboration with Stephen Bell of History of Everything. We've got a great series of guests slated for our next shooting session, and we will be joined by Reed Choi we were joined by Reed Choi, but that episode hasn't come out yet. That should be coming out very soon, though. I think potentially this weekend. But we've also got Andrew Briggs, Roanoke Tales, Dash Rendar, and some others slated to come on, so that is going to be a very fun series of episodes coming out over on that channel. You can also check out Weird Bible, which I am finally getting the wheels moving on the new show for that. And of course, if you want to make sure that you catch our videos, the best way to do so is by, first of all, hit the notification bell because YouTube just wants you to do it. But because they never actually use the notification system, come join us on Discord at bit.ly/jointhelodge. I think that covers just about everything, so I'm Aiden Madison. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.